China, in 1937, stood at a precarious crossroads, with tensions mounting along the border with Manchukuo, a puppet state administered by an increasingly aggressive Japan. While the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek pursued a careful strategy of avoiding direct confrontation with Japanese forces in order to first consolidate power by eliminating his internal communist rivals, a plan that was ultimately complicated by the rising tide of anti-Japanese sentiment sweeping the country, which compelled him to negotiate a truce with the communists and prepare for the inevitable larger conflict. The spark that ignited full-scale war came on the 7th of July at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beiping, where a dispute over a missing Japanese soldier led to an exchange of gunfire. And within days, Japanese reinforcements flooded the region. But this time, China was prepared to resist, with Chiang Kai-shek delivering a solemn warning in a speech 10 days after the incident, cautioning the nation to fully understand the meaning of endurance and the scale of sacrifice that lay ahead, declaring that once that stage was reached, there would be no choice but to fight to the bitter end. A sentiment echoed powerfully in the popular song March of the Volunteers, which would go on to become China's official national anthem in 1978. The fighting around Beiping rapidly escalated into a full-scale invasion, with some historians marking this moment as the true beginning of the Second World War. And although Chiang Kai-shek's National Revolutionary Army found itself in the unusual position of receiving military support from both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, it proved insufficient to withstand the Japanese Imperial Army's superior tactics, modern equipment, and decisive air superiority, which allowed Japanese forces to smash through Chinese defenses and, within just 6 weeks, occupy a broad swath of northern China, including the old imperial capital. The conflict then shifted dramatically to Shanghai, China's largest city and its commercial and cultural heart, where the international settlement established by Western imperial powers in the 19th century had long served as a cosmopolitan hub jointly administered by 14 nations, and where Japan had recently surpassed Britain as the dominant foreign presence, with 30,000 civilians, 8,000 Marines, and 32 naval vessels stationed there. Chiang Kai-shek recognized an opportunity to divert Japanese attention from the northern offensive, while simultaneously drawing international scrutiny to the conflict. And on the 13th of August, he ordered Chinese forces to attack Japanese ships moored in the harbor, triggering a devastating response as Japanese reinforcements poured in, and Shanghai and its surrounding region became a massive battlefront, drawing in nearly 1 million troops on both sides, reducing the city to rubble through fierce urban combat involving tanks in the streets, poison gas attacks, and relentless air raids that inflicted particularly severe casualties on the National Revolutionary Army's elite German-trained divisions. As the Chinese position became untenable in late October and a withdrawal began, a single battalion was left behind to defend the Sihong warehouse. And in 6 days of desperate fighting, these soldiers bought crucial time for other units to escape. Their sacrifice witnessed directly by foreign observers sheltered in the international settlement, whose reports and images traveled rapidly around the world and turned Western public opinion firmly against Japan. What followed, however, shocked even those who had already witnessed the brutality of the conflict. As Japanese forces pursued the retreating National Revolutionary Army to Nanjing, the nationalist capital, breaching its defenses after a ferocious 4-day battle and entering the city on the 13th of December, whereupon soldiers went on a 6-week rampage of looting, torture, mass rape, and murder that became known as the Rape of Nanjing, with estimates of civilian deaths ranging between 50,000 and 300,000. While approximately 30,000 Chinese prisoners of war were executed in mass shootings, and others were decapitated, buried alive, or used for bayonet practice, with bodies piling in the streets burned and dumped in the Yangtze River. The international safety zone within the city was managed by German businessman and Nazi supporter John Rabe, who was horrified by the carnage and appealed to Hitler to intervene. But the fall of Nanjing instead convinced the Nazi leadership that Japan was the stronger strategic partner, leading Germany to sever its military support to China entirely. Though the atrocities were condemned by the United States and the League of Nations, no concrete action was taken. And the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war, forced prostitution on a massive scale, made in the deployment of chemical and biological weapons against civilians and prisoners of war, continued to characterize Japan's prosecution of the conflict, attacking many thousands more. As Japanese forces advanced toward Wuhan, a rare Chinese victory at the Battle of Taiers-Wang offered a brief moment of relief, but could not halt the broader Japanese offensive. And in a desperate and ultimately catastrophic decision, Chiang Kai-shek's government ordered the breach of the Yellow River dikes at Wuankou, in the hope that flooding would impede the Japanese advance. But with no warning given to the civilian population in the river's path, the resulting deluge submerged farmland and entire villages across the densely populated North China Plain, killing approximately 500,000 civilians, displacing 5 million more, and devastating agricultural land for years afterward in what stands as one of the greatest man-made disasters in history. Perpetrated by a government against its own people, and which ultimately failed in its military objective as Japanese forces simply bypassed the flooded areas. The battle for Wuhan that followed involved nearly 2 million combatants and was fiercely contested over 4 months. But Japanese air superiority and the widespread use of poison gas again proved decisive. And with the city's fall, the nationalist government retreated 500 miles further inland to Chongqing in the western province of Sichuan, while Japan installed a puppet government in Nanjing and found itself in control of China's largest cities, though its army was too exhausted to deliver another major offensive blow, leaving the conflict mired in a prolonged stalemate that historians designate the Second Sino-Japanese War, in which the Chinese themselves called the War of Resistance. By 1939, China's primary foreign backer was the Soviet Union, which supplied crucial military aid and provided pilots and aircraft that formed the backbone of the Nationalist Air Force, while simultaneously fighting its own largely forgotten border war with Japan on Russia's far eastern frontier. But that summer, with European war imminent, Stalin negotiated a truce with Japan signed on the 15th of September. And 2 days later, Soviet troops invaded Poland as a partner of Nazi Germany, leaving China without its most significant source of external support. Chongqing endured more than 200 Japanese air raids, while in northern China, the Communists continued waging large-scale guerrilla campaigns against Japanese occupation. Though all cooperation between nationalists and communists had again broken down entirely, foreign arms and supplies continued to reach the nationalists via French Indochina until 1940, when Japan occupied that territory to sever the supply line, an act of expansionism that alarmed Western powers, whose Southeast Asian colonies were now within range of Japanese military strength, prompting the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands to impose an oil embargo on Japan that threatened to cripple both its economy and its war effort in China. Rather than withdrawing, Tokyo chose to gamble on open war. And in December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, simultaneously bombing American and British installations across Southeast Asia and rapidly capturing Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies in a series of bold and sweeping advances. The attack on Pearl Harbor, however, had awakened the industrial might of the United States. And within a year, American factories were producing more vehicles, ships, and aircraft than all other combatant nations combined. With China receiving more than $1.5 billion in armaments through the Lend-Lease program, and with supplies flown into the country from India along a perilous route over the Himalayas known among American pilots, as the hump after Japan's capture of Burma severed overland routes, Chiang Kai-shek also received a new chief military advisor in the form of the famously blunt American General Joseph Stilwell. His contempt for Chiang was barely concealed and entirely mutual, while additional support came through Major General Claire Chennault's celebrated Flying Tigers, an elite volunteer squadron that achieved remarkable success against Japanese air power and was eventually reinforced by regular United States air units, whose operations led to the construction of multiple American air bases across China in November 1943. China had formally joined the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union as one of the 4 major Allied powers, with Chiang attending a conference in Cairo alongside Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, who acknowledged the importance of Chinese resistance in tying down nearly 1 million Japanese soldiers and pledged increased support, though in practice, neither Britain nor the United States viewed the Chinese theater as a primary strategic priority. Meanwhile, what remained of China's economy was collapsing under the combined weight of wartime destruction. Rampant inflation, pervasive corruption, and a devastated industrial base, making it increasingly difficult for the nationalist government to pay and equip its soldiers, who deserted in growing numbers even as Japan prepared its largest single operation of the war. In April 1944, with the broader Pacific Campaign turning against Japan, Tokyo launched Operation Ichigo, a massive offensive designed to link northern China with Indochina and destroy the American air bases in southern China, being used to bomb the Japanese home islands. And the weakened Chinese forces broke under the assault, losing several air bases as the Japanese achieved their territorial objectives by October, delivering another severe blow to Chiang's military reputation and to American confidence in the nationalist government, particularly as some observers contrasted nationalist dysfunction with what they perceived as the greater effectiveness of communist guerrilla operations in the north. Yet Operation Ichigo ultimately came too late to alter Japan's strategic trajectory. In the spring of 1945, the last major Japanese offensive in China was repulsed and Chinese forces began to counterattack, while American strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands culminated in August 1945 with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the simultaneous Soviet invasion of Manchuria compelled Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's unconditional surrender, bringing the Second World War to a close at a cost to China of between 15 and 20 million lives, surpassed among Allied nations only by the Soviet Union's losses. With millions more wounded, displaced, and destitute across a country requiring complete reconstruction, Japan's defeat created a power vacuum that both nationalists and communists moved immediately to fill. With Soviet forces facilitating communist acquisition of Manchuria and captured Japanese weapons while American and British transport flew, nationalist troops into northern and eastern China, and though Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong met for brief United States-sponsored peace talks in Chongqing, the agreement they reached quickly dissolved, with Chiang reportedly remarking to his aides that the sky cannot have two suns. And by 1946, full civil war had erupted as nationalist forces launched an assault on communist-held territories in the north. Despite initial nationalist advances using elite, American-trained divisions to capture Shenyang and the communist wartime base at Yan'an, the communists weathered these blows by avoiding pitched battles and reverting to proven guerrilla tactics, while their program of land reform in rural areas attracted enormous popular support. And in stark contrast, the nationalist government's reputation continued to deteriorate through a combination of military incompetence, institutional corruption, catastrophic economic mismanagement that produced hyperinflation, and the general collapse of civil order that alienated both urban populations and the countryside, despite the continued flow of American loans and military supplies. By 1947, communist forces had been reorganized into the People's Liberation Army, numbering nearly 1 million strong, and Mao judged the moment ripe to abandon guerrilla warfare in favor of conventional operations, launching a series of successful counteroffensives that captured territory, weapons, and supplies, while conscripting nationalist deserters and prisoners. And in September 1948, 3 simultaneous major offensives devastated the nationalist military, sweeping them from Manchuria with losses exceeding 400,000 men, and capturing Tianjin and Suzhou in campaigns that cost the nationalists another 500,000 casualties, along with much of their remaining best equipment, so that in just 4 months, the communists had won 3 decisive victories and driven their enemies from northern China entirely. The following spring, the communist advance accelerated, taking Nanjing in April and Shanghai in May amid chaos and the collapse of nationalist authority. And on the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong stood before a packed Tiananmen Square in Beijing to proclaim the founding of the People's Republic of China, with the remaining nationalist-held areas falling that winter, bringing to an end for years of civil war that had cost more than 2 million military casualties and perhaps another 5 million civilian lives through combat, famine, and disease, as Chiang Kai-shek retreated with approximately 2 million nationalist troops and civilian refugees to Taiwan, where the Republic of China government would continue to exist while the mainland entered a new era under communist rule. Inheriting the immense task of reconstructing a nation shattered by more than a decade of foreign invasion and internal conflict,